The Philadelphia Eagles have a lot of good players on both sides of the ball heading into the 2023 season. Who are the most important on offense and defense? Gino and I will rank them on this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Shout out to the everydayers for making us a part of your day, Monday through Friday. I'm Louis DiBiase alongside my co-host, Gino Camilleri. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Gino, an exciting show today because, as I mentioned, the Eagles roster this year equally as loaded as the 2022 team that had so many records broken, that I think was the most talented team in franchise history. Mm-hmm. They showed it on the field. They make it to the Super Bowl, nearly beat Patrick Mahomes in a shootout to do it. This year's team, I think, has a lower floor just because I think there's more young players replacing some veterans like Sidney Brown in for Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, Jalen Carter in for Javon Hargrave, Nakobe Dean in for TJ Edwards. The list goes on, but the ceiling is equally as high. Today, we're going to talk about importance because I think there's a lot of veterans that are going to keep their important roles this year, but there's a lot of young guys stepping up, and it's at positions that they need, I feel like, more than last year. Where there was last year, there were some good young players that stepped up, but it was almost like they didn't have to as much as they would have to this year. Not that there's a lot of make-or-break holes they had to fill, but I think it's more than last year.
You have mentioned a couple times this week that it's like a Jenga game, and when you look at those players, the 48th, 49th, 50th guy, those are like the top Jenga pieces. Mm-hmm. You take one, it's the first move of the game, but then there's guys that, even some young guys this go around, Lou, that are instrumental. I look at Nakobe Dean just to make one name. If he goes down, does that topple your Jenga tower? Does that topple what your defense can be? Obviously, the low-hanging fruit is Jalen Hurts, but that's the importance, right? You could never have a Jenga game without the foundational pieces. And that's what this is. And every team has these guys, and some it's an easier discussion than others, like the Philadelphia Eagles. It's going to be a little tougher. For sure. But when you look at it, I think there are some guys that have been here long enough. You kind of know their position in the team, and there's a reason why they have stuck around. And that's because they're the foundation. Those are the core pieces that keep this thing afloat. But the Eagles have done a good job, Lou. Even when they do find those pieces, that next man up mentality. Look at 2017, how many guys stepped into big roles. Even last year down the stretch, how those young guys started
2018 and 2019 too.
100%. And that's the great thing about it, that in a game of Jenga, when you do make those big moves, if the thing doesn't collapse, you got to find a way to overcome adversity and keep the game playing. But there are some that will affect the tower, quote unquote, a lot more than some other guys. I mean, you're looking at Aaron Sipos. Is he number 53 for you on that Jenga tower? Probably
for sure. Gino, what I want to do, and we're going to do it this way, we're going to rank our top 5 players on both sides of the ball based on importance. So it's not the top 5 best players, because you could argue there's certain guys that are better than others, but somebody might play a more important position. They might play a role where there's not as much depth, a position where you just have more responsibility. It's more important in the grand scheme of actually winning important football games. So I want to rank it top 5 most important players on this team on both sides of the ball rather than the best. And we'll start on the offensive side. Can we exclude Jalen Hurts? Because
you have to.
Obviously, he's the most important player at the most important position. Not only that, but the style of play, he makes up for so much offensive production with his arm, but also his legs. You know, the red zone, 4th and 1, 3rd and 2, you know, his power run style, pretty much his leadership. He's obviously one of the most important players in the entire NFL. So we'll do 1 through 5 on offense, removing Jalen Hurts.
Yeah, you kind of have to, because every team, especially if you have an elite quarterback, relies on that position more than anything. And it's so easy to just say that and use it as a cop-out, but there are other guys that, hey, if they go down, that influences your quarterback position. That might make the position a little tougher. It might get a couple more guys on defense, allowing them to come into the pocket. And I think my top guys are going to be on that most important position, which is the offensive line. And then the skill positions, I would kind of say you have a little more leeway.
My number 1 is Lane Johnson, Gino.
Yeah, I was going back and forth. Is it a combination of Lane and his counterpart on the other side? But I think without a doubt, if you look at the numbers, just pure statistic based on when Lane is in the lineup versus when Lane is out of the lineup,
Nobody else has that impact.
No, you talk about an influential player in any organization. I mean, this is a decade plus of data points where when he goes out, things totally do go awry, and the respect he gets is well-deserved. He's not just the best right tackle in the league. He could arguably be the best tackle without a doubt.
Exactly. And right tackles are as important as left tackles now, Gino, because there are so many dominant elite edge rushers that line up on that side. Look at Haason Reddick. Micah Parsons lines up on that side a lot of the time. Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa, the list really does go on and on. So I feel like Lane Johnson is number one because he's a tackle, a premier position. He's an elite player at his spot. He hasn't allowed a sack in years, since 2020. He's elite in pass protection, the run game as well. He's a leader. And as you mentioned, and we don't know what happens when Jason Kelce's out because that really doesn't happen. We've seen more instances where Lane is out, due to mental health reasons or his ankle. There's been a lot of ups and downs with Johnson's career for sure. And as you mentioned, like last year, that Saints game when Driscoll had to come in because Johnson got hurt in that ending against Dallas, night and day. And I know Jalen Hurts wasn't in to make up for some of that with his mobility, but I think Lane Johnson's number one, man. And I think you can make the argument Jordan Mailata's maybe number two. I have Kelce just because he wears so many different hats for this football team. Like, is the drop-off from Kelce to Juergens worse than Mailata to, I don't know, Tyler Steen? Probably not, but Kelce is just, like, he's the guy. So I put Jason Kelce 2 and then Jordan Mailata 3.
That's fair. I kind of 1A, 1B Lane Johnson and Jason Kelce because it's just as important. The center is arguably your second quarterback on the field, right? What Jason
Especially
Kelce
when Kelce does what he does.
Exactly. What Stoutland allows him to do, which is call out the protections. A lot of the time he is that guy helping Jalen Hurts, seeing things that he can't see. And not only that, he's a leader on and off the field. He has basically helped become part of the personnel department, scouting Cam Juergens, allowing him to come in. So it's not just what he does on the field, it's off the field as well. But it's 1A, 1B with those two guys. You got to keep them as healthy as possible. And Lane Johnson, he gets cleared today to play after he had surgery after the Super Bowl. So it's exciting time for those two veterans, and rightfully so. There's a reason why they've been here for a decade plus.
So do we agree it goes Lane, Kelce, Mailata?
I would have to agree as well. I think in that three-headed dragon of importance, you can get by with the guards. Guards, a lot of the time, you can try to hide them a little bit more, but you're still set at the left guard spot with Landon Dickerson, who's unbelievable. And then at right guard, you might luck into Cam Juergens being the most underrated guy on this line, and he comes out there and he plays a big role. But those big three, nothing goes without them.
Right. And then for me, Gino, 4 and 5 were the wide receivers. I put actually Devontae Smith ahead of A.J. Brown. I think Devontae this year is going to blow up. Just the amount of ways that he can win, and the same with A.J. Brown, but it's basically 4A, 4B. I mean, I don't want to put one guy ahead of the other. I wrote Devontae Smith first, but those two receivers, I mean, you look at the impact they've had on Jalen Hurts' development, it's so obvious that having 2 star receivers and having a star tight end like Dallas Goedert helps out a lot too, but what a receiver can do and the amount of ways they can win, even versus the top tight ends, is another level. So I think Smith and Brown have to be 4 and 5.
So I put the wide receivers, the big two, at number 5 when I put Dallas Goedert at 4, simply because what is that drop off between Goddard to Dan Arnold versus if you're
good way to look at it. Sure.
One of Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown, because we believe that both of those guys are number 1. So if you're out A.J. for 3 or 4 games, I still believe you can get by with Devontae. Whereas if this was a couple years ago and it goes Devontae to Jalen Reagor, then I changed the conversation.
2021. Yeah, that's a good point.
I look at Dallas Goedert, man, and his extension as a blocker on the offensive line and being that element that really helped Jalen Hurts become that middle of the field passer where he really lacked in 2021. Sure. That's an important role. And have they found that Zach Ertz to the Dallas Goedert yet? No, they have not. But they found that at the wide receiver position. But without those 2 wide receivers, the pass game isn't what it is. You even saw the evolution from 21 to 22. So, man, those 3 guys, I think it's pretty simple what the foundation of this team is, right? Guys that affect the passing game and also can help out in the run game because Devontae and AJ are great blockers on the outside. So is Dallas. So are all those three linemen. But first and foremost, who is helping the most important position player on the field being your quarterback? I think it's those 6 guys.
And maybe I'll put A.J. Brown ahead of Devontae Smith for now because outside of Lane Johnson, Gino, I don't think we have seen a drastic change that one player can make that's not at the quarterback position on offense. Outside of like Lane Johnson going from Lane to another right tackle, but going from, and we mentioned this the other day when we were talking about upgrades, going from Jalen Reagor to A.J. Brown, the difference from 2021, even at the end when they got hot versus what they could do in 2022. You mentioned Dallas Goedert's ability to win over the middle. A.J. Brown can do it too. Brown can win everywhere. It was so apparent. And again, yes, we haven't seen what we would do without Kelce and Devontae because they've been healthy, but Brown and Lane showed they showed the impact when they're there and when they're not. So I think we mostly agree. It's the guys protecting Jalen Hurts and it's the guys that he throws the football to. The rest, not to say they're not as important, but I would actually, they're not as important. They're a little more replaceable for sure. Gino, I think it's going to be a little bit more of an interesting conversation on the defensive side of the football. So we'll rank our top 5 most important Eagles on defense coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's show is sponsored by Built Bar. Looking for a delicious snack but don't want all of the sugar and calories? Then you need the best tasting protein bar ever built. You got to try these if you're like me and you want to make healthier snack choices, especially in the summer, but you don't want to compromise on taste. We've got just the thing for you. Built Bars and Built Puffs. Built Bars are healthy and taste amazing. What makes them so good? They're covered in 100% real dark chocolate. That's right, real chocolate. They're coming in some unbelievably incredible flavors. You got churro, peanut butter, brownie, cookies and cream. Not sure how Built does it, but these bars taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. What's even better, they're healthy, only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar with a whopping 17 grams of protein. And now you don't need to wait. For years, we've been telling you to get your box at Built.com. Now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club, while you can still get your specialty flavors at Built.com as well. Head to your nearest Walmart, walk to the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built Bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate bar, or coconut puff. If you're close to Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box with our hit flavors, brownie, batter puff, and churro puff. You can thank us later, and we thank Built Bar for sponsoring the Locked On Eagles podcast today. All right, Eagles fans, we're continuing on this Thursday edition of Locked On Eagles. Thanks so much for making us a part of your day. Shout out to the Everydayers for making us your first listen Monday through Friday. Today, Gino, we are ranking Eagles for 2023 based on their importance for this roster on both sides of the ball. So on offense, we pretty much agreed. I had Lane Johnson and Jason Kelce 1 and 2 with Jordan Mailata at number 3. You had that as well. You had Dallas Goedert at 4, and then you put Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown together at 5. I had Devontae at 4, A.J. Brown at 5. Then I did switch, though. So I'd say A.J.'s 4, Smith's 5. Tough to keep Goddard out of there, but I just think, again, the impact those receivers have is absolutely incredible. And then on the defensive side of the ball, Gino, this is where it gets a little interesting. There's been a lot more change this year, but I still think some guys have certain roles, even if they're replacing other players. Regardless of the player, the role is important. So even if they haven't technically proved that they can be that guy yet, I would still say they're, again, maybe not the best player on this unit, but their role is important enough to be in the top 5.
With the turnover on defense, this made this discussion very intriguing. And
yeah,
there's a reason why they committed so much of that money to the offense, extended a lot of those guys, kept them around for as long as they did, and they weren't able to afford those guys on defense, the TJ Edwards, Kaiser Whites, Chauncey's, that inevitably left town, but they still do have foundational pieces there that you're looking at and saying, I don't know if you survive without him for a season. And if he gets injured, what is the drop off at depth? And I don't know what you're thinking, but I think right along the lines of the positions that affect the pass game, what happens if one of Darius Slay or James Bradbury goes down? I don't know if that's what your line of thinking was, but with me, it's
close.
Like you get rid of one of those two guys. Who's the next man up? Greedy Williams? Is it going to be Zach McPherson? Is it going to be one of the young guys that you brought in as well? We'll see. But right now you have those big two, and I think it's tough to say that there's two positions outside of cornerback that are as important that affect the pass.
Yeah, for sure. I had Darius Slay number 2 for that reason, because you look at depth. if you lose a pass rusher, you have a lot more depth on the defensive line. I like the young talent they have at corner, Gino. I love that they have Kelly Ringo, Greedy Williams, Zach McPherson. This is the most young depth they've had, I think, in quite some time. That's exciting. But at the same time, again, it's a much bigger drop-off. And I put Darius Slay over Bradbury at 2 because I think Bradbury was incredible last year. Obviously, he was an all-pro, voted higher than Slay, but I think Slay can cover pretty much any kind of receiver, and I trust him more against like this year for Miami. I want Darius Slay on Tyreek Hill probably more than I want James Bradbury. You know what I mean? Although it'll be tough because they have Jalen Waddle on the other side too. But I totally agree when it comes to like the importance of the position, Slay and how he can cover so many different types of receivers and the depth. Corner's got to be top 2, but I put Haason Reddick number 1, man. And it's not only because he is an elite pass rusher, and that is so important, but he's so clutch. I mean, how many big-time moments did he step up last year, including the NFC Championship, taking out Brock Purdy, but the late-game sack against Trevor Lawrence and against Jacksonville, the sacks against Washington. He stepped up late against Arizona. So many moments like that for sure. And he drops back in coverage. He wears a ton of hats. I think Haason Reddick had to be number 1 for me.
I was close there, but then I'm like, man, they have refilled that so well there. And it's like,
sure. So you're thinking more of like a depth perspective.
Yeah, more like what is going to be the drop off? Like what is going to be the change, the delta, if something were to happen to one of these guys? Like, how does it affect the Jenga block? And with Haason Reddick, at the end of the day, it's like Josh Sweat being your best pass rusher on the edge, the worst thing on earth, with Nolan Smith and Brandon Graham creating a nice number 2 and 3 off of the edge. I believe that you can get by with that. Haason Reddick is easily my number 2 simply because of all the factors that you said, and as well how he came around in coverage towards the end and really started to be that hybrid linebacker.
You look at that Houston game in the red zone, he made that big pass breakup when the game was close.
Without a doubt, he's an MVP, an all defensive player, all pro, any category that you want. And he affects the pass game as much as the guys on the outside do. The ball doesn't get to the guys on the outside if Haason Reddick up front can get to them. But I think with Nolan Smith being your number 2 or 3 and Brandon Graham there as well, you can get by if there were the drop off. But his importance shouldn't go unappreciated because you saw how big of an upgrade, we get back to that conversation, it was to go from Brandon Graham starting and Derek Barnett being your number 2 with Josh Sweat to Haason being number 1, and then Josh can feast on those number 2s.
Gino, number 3, I had Nakobe Dean. And
agreed.
Yeah, I think it's because you look at they lost TJ Edwards and Kazir White. He's basically all they have on the front lines at linebacker. You have Nicholas Morrow, but I don't think he can do what Nakobe Dean can. You look at the safeties this year, unknown, right? Terrell Edmonds is good, but he's not CGJ. Unknown what we're going to get with Reed Blankenship in year 2, and Sidney Brown we're very high on, the 3rd-round pick from Illinois, but a lot of unknown at safety this year. There's less depth. You lost both starters at linebacker. He's going to be that one guy at those 2 spots you're going to have on every single down. He's going to be a communicator, right? He, is probably going to wear the green dot on this defense. And so he's going to be so responsible for things up front, stuff behind him. He's going to have to be a coverage linebacker too. So I think for all those reasons, Dean's number 3. And again, that's why it's not that he's the best player. He hasn't proven much of anything yet, but importance is based on the role too and depth factors and all these things that we're talking about.
The reason I put him at 3 and not at 1, which you could easily make the argument that if he goes down, that completely takes away your quarterback of the defense.
Because who's your line? I mean, it's just Morrow at that point. And Sean Bradley.
Sean Bradley's going to be your number 2 at this point, and Ben Van Summer and an undrafted free agent is going to be your number 3.
Or Davian Taylor comes back.
Yeah, or Davian Taylor makes his way back onto the roster. But when you talk about the collapsing Jenga block, if Nakobe does go down, that completely gets rid of the tower. But I think you kind of had to put into factor the importance of how the Eagles hold these positions. So it's like, are you going to value a linebacker over an edge rusher and 2 cornerbacks? It
certainly makes less of an impact than a James Bradbury for sure.
In my opinion.
Yeah. There's a lot of different ways to look at it.
But at the same time, he has big shoes to fill in. And the reason I'm hesitant to put him higher too is maybe, just maybe, I do believe he comes out and is a star. But what if he is just an average linebacker in this year before he takes that jump to year 3? Is it as important as having TJ Edwards last year, where I said TJ would probably be one of those guys that you can't live without? Well, then they bring Kaiser White in, and now you have neither of them. So can you live without Nakobe Dean? We'll see.
Yeah, for sure. Gino, who's your 4? I'm interested now to see where this lines up because now you have to start throwing in some defensive linemen, or maybe you're sticking at corner, safety.
I'm going to go with one that might shock a few people, but if you hear my rationale, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think Fletcher Cox is number 4 because after going from a season where you had so much veteran leadership on the interior of the defensive line, where you could get by with Javon Hargrave because he was at an all-pro caliber level, and then Ndamukong Suh and Linval Joseph come in, there's one guy who has anchored that position for now a decade plus that if he goes down, you're going to have to find a full-time starter to take that position. You do have the young guns that are very promising, but right now, I still got to see Jalen Carter go out there and play, right? I still got to see the evolution that Jordan Davis is going to make. And Milton Williams might be his rightful heir and replacement. But if he goes down, man, and he's not going to be a full-time starter, he'll be a rotational guy, 45 to 50% of the snaps. But if he plays the way he played last year, Lou, how big of an impact is that going to make if you don't have him on the interior? Because now your depth, everybody takes a hit. You're not going to be as fresh on the inside. Jordan Davis probably has to take a bigger role. Carter is going to take a bigger role in his rookie year. And Milton Williams being your starting 3-tech, I love the idea that he gets more playing time. But as it stands currently, do you trust him? So I say Fletcher Cox.
Good point. And at the same time, having an elite pass rushing defensive tackle is so important. And we've seen the benefit of that with Cox for a decade plus and Javon Hargrave over the last 3 years. That's why I had Fletcher Cox at number 5. Gino, number 4, I put Jordan Davis. And he has not proven it yet, kind of like Nakobe Dean, but it's similar rationale. You're going to use a lot of lighter boxes. You're going to, use more 3 safety looks. Your linebackers are not proven at all. I mean, Morrow was solid in Chicago, but he's nothing to write home about. Nakobe Dean right now is an unknown. So Jordan Davis is like your number 1 run stopper. Right now, Linval Joseph is not on this roster. So who's your second quote-unquote nose tackle, right? That guy in the middle, it's Tui Peloto. So again, having a pass rushing interior lineman to me and that do-it-all player is definitely something I love and I prioritize more, but having Jordan Davis in the role that he has this year, I think is extremely important, not to mention if he can become a pass rusher, what that can do. If he can stay on the field with the impact we already know he can make against the run. We saw it last year. He was flashing. If he can develop pass rush moves now too, that's a very important spot to have because even Cox, Carter, Milton Williams, I am so excited about that trio this year. Heck, even Kentavious Street and Moro Ojomo, but they're all different from who Jordan Davis is, and I think that's an important role. Again, he's not the best player on this list. He's not proven much, but it's a big shoe to fill, or big shoes to fill this year.
Like the NCAA tournament, he was my last one out, right? He would have probably been a play-in game guy. But I look at what you lost, Lou, in terms of coverage from hash to hash, not from hash to sideline. Avonte Maddox. If he goes down, you don't have Chauncey Gardner-Johnson anymore to step into that role.
Interesting
right?
point.
And you don't even have a Marcus Epps to play that one high. Who's going to be that true cover slot?
Yeah, because if you bring Sidney Brown in the slot, if that was your idea, then who's Blankenship?
Who's your single high guy? Exactly.
Ooh, I don't like that.
I mean, if we had a longer conversation, you might make the argument that if he goes down, you have less depth there than maybe Darius Slay, but you know what Slay and Bradbury can do shutting down true number 1s, but slot corner might be the most underrated position in the whole sport. And we've appreciated it so much because Avonte has been that good. And when
he has dealt with injuries too. Last year, he just couldn't stay healthy. He was having a great year. He just couldn't stay on the field.
And you don't have Chauncey, who played that role in New Orleans, to step in right away. So Jordan Davis was 6 for me. I go with Avonte because I think he's just too integral to this team. And maybe he takes some of those safety snaps that we're talking about, Lou, since he did that before. But in a year from now, I think Jordan Davis is one of those top 3 guys any day of the week for us in this conversation.
Yeah. All right, Gino, we're wrapping up this Thursday edition of Locked On Eagles, ranking our top 5 most important Eagles on both sides of the ball, offense and defense for 2023. So we ranked them. Who were your cutoffs? So on offense and defense, you mentioned this in segment 2, like, oh, if it was March Madness, this would be the guy that gets the play-in, right? So who were the guys on offense and defense that just barely missed the list?
So running back, I don't think there's going to be a huge drop-off if you were to lose any of those 3 guys, right? You can kind of get by in that regard.
Like you're 4th and 5th. If you have to use Boston Scott and Trey Sermon at some point, I think you can get by.
Yeah, you could get by for a game or two because your quarterback is the best guy in terms of that. And then I look at wide receiver. If OZ or Watkins goes down or vice versa, one of those guys can step into that position. But I look at Landon Dickerson, and he was right there for me because you're already going to try and quote-unquote hide Cam Jurgens, right? A not natural guard who's going to step in and play guard. Who's that next? Is Jack Driscoll going to have to be the left guard for you?
Or do you move Steen to left guard?
Yeah, does Steen take left guard snaps? A rookie in that regard? And what is the drop-off there? He was right at the fringe for me. And then on the defensive side of the ball, it might sound crazy, but as good of a tackler as Reed Blankenship is, you lost a lot of tackle statistics year over year. Guys that were able to come down and plug the box for you. Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, TJ Edwards, Kaiser White. It might be him and Terrell Edmonds are like a 6A, 6B in that conversation, or 7A, 7B right behind Jordan Davis for me. But, man, if one of those guys go out, where does the tackle production come from? Where is that surefire tackler? Terrell Edmonds is going to be tasked to cover some of those tight ends underneath in those areas. And as important as Sidney Brown is on the back end, what happens in those 5 to 10-yard areas is as important in today's game because you get a tight end going free up the seam and Terrell Edmonds doesn't cover him or Reed Blankenship isn't in and you're going to Justin Evans, who might not be as good as you think he is. That could be a huge drop-off. And that's the great part about this discussion, Lou, is that we can have these conversations because you have so much depth. Where if you look at the Arizona Cardinals, for example, you might have 1 or 2 guys that you could have this discussion about.
For sure.
Right? We can go 7, 8 deep position-wise.
I was going to say, man, I mean, I a lot of the players you said I had on the fringe, and Dallas Goedert I didn't even put in my top 5 on offense. On defense, I even said Jalen Carter was almost in there.
Fair.
I put Fletcher Cox because he's the proven veteran pass rusher on the inside, but you look at Fletcher Cox even last year with 7 sacks, an incredible year, but compared to what Javon Hargrave was doing, it was way more hot and cold. Fletcher would have some massive games, but there would be some other games too where he wasn't as big of a factor as Javon Hargrave was. So Jalen Carter might have to be that guy that steps up consistently as your best defensive tackle when it comes to a pure pass rushing standpoint, game after game. So that's why Jalen Carter, for me, almost got in there. And I left James Bradbury off because I chose to put 1 corner in and I put Darius Slay. But having 2 shutdown corners, especially when you look at the gauntlet of trios and duos the Eagles play at receiver this year. I mean, Washington, Seattle, Miami, Dallas, the list continues on. There's a lot of teams with great weapons, so you need multiple corners. So Bradbury was right in there. But yeah, like you mentioned, man, the Eagles have a luxury of saying there is like 10 guys. I mean, the entire starting lineup compared to other teams, it's like there are some stars. So it's definitely it's a tougher conversation to have. Like, as you mentioned, Arizona, I think it's obvious who the most important players are, and it's a pretty quick drop-off.
And I got one for you here, Lou. This might go a little under the radar. What if Marcus Mariota isn't there those couple games that Jalen Hurts might not play this season? What's that drop-off? You're going to run Ian Book or Tanner McKee out there?
No, thank you.
Don't love that. I mean, that you can make the conversation, Lou, that might be the biggest drop-off on the roster. After quarterback 1 and 2, like
it
who
normally
comes in?
will be.
And it will be in Philadelphia, too. I mean, even in the National Football League, man, how many quarterbacks are playing a full 17-game calendar season?
Well, they're all mobile now, so most don't.
They don't. And Marcus Mariota might be that important in the grand scheme of things in terms of seeding, right? If there's 2 games and it turns out to be what happened with Gardner Minshew last year, where you lose those 2 games, but maybe an NFC team is right up against your tail like they were last year. Let's say Marcus isn't there. You throw Tanner McKee out there, and then all of a sudden you're getting these games where you have a Josh Johnson out there and you don't really have a quarterback, and you're finding ways to have Rashad Penny take wildcat snaps for some of those. So it's a great conversation in terms of team building. And this is exactly what happens in personnel departments too. And I think Philadelphia, Lou, has done a great job, not just replacing those Jenga pieces, but putting the Jenga pieces that they lost, or rather took out from the tower, and put them in a way that can keep the structure where it's not craziness and one of the blocks is leaning at the bottom where you have a quarterback who has no knees or just one wide receiver, just one corner. They've done a great job creating that infrastructure that really can compete for this calendar year with enough depth to get you by in those late months of the season.
All right, Eagles fans, that's going to do it for another edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. I'm Louis DiBiase alongside my co-host, Gino Camilleri. Thanks for making us your first listen each and every day. Shout out to the everydayers. Continue to make us your first listen tomorrow, as Gino and I have a fun Eagles draft to do. So we're talking about importance of players. Tomorrow, we're going to build 2 Eagles teams with the incredible talent that they have on this 2023 roster. Subscribe wherever you get the show and on YouTube as well. Hit us up on Twitter at LockedOnBirds, at GC24_football, and at DiBiase LOE. I'm Louis DiBiase for Gino Camilleri signing off. As always, thank you for downloading. Thank you for watching and listening. And let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.